Imagine a winter so long and bitter that your bread froze solid before you could eat it, and firewood cost more than your wages. Tonight, we step softly into the frost-bitten centuries of the Little Ice Age, where entire villages starved, rivers turned to ice, and the poor were left to battle cold with little more than hope. This wasn't a fairy tale winter, it was survival on the edge of extinction. So pull your blanket close, Dust, and let this frozen chapter of history gently guide you into sleep. If softly told tales of forgotten struggles and quiet resilience help your mind unwind, then you're right where you belong. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon to join us nightly on journeys through the darker, colder, yet deeply human corners of history. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You might think that the worst disasters in history announce themselves dramatically, with earthquakes that split the earth or volcanoes that darken the sky. But the catastrophe that would kill more than 1.5 million people across Europe began quietly, almost mundanely, on a spring morning in 1315 when the rain simply refused to stop. It started in May, just after the spring planting season. Picture a peasant farmer named Willem, kneeling in the muddy fields outside what would one day become the Netherlands. His hands are caked with earth as he pushes the last of his precious seed barley into the waterlogged soil. The rain has been falling for 3 days straight, turning the carefully prepared furrows into rivulets of brown water. Willem's wife, Greet, calls from their cottage doorway, her voice carrying the weight of worry that has settled over their small farming community like a heavy blanket. The New Yorker tells us that this was no ordinary spring shower. The Little Ice Age, that long period of cooling that would grip Europe from roughly 1300 to 1850, was entering one of its most brutal phases. The climate had been shifting for decades, but 1315 marked a turning point, the beginning of what scholars would later call the Great Famine, though the people living through it had no such grand terminology for their suffering. Willem doesn't know about global climate patterns or the complex atmospheric conditions that have trapped storm systems over northern Europe. He only knows that the rain that began in May shows no signs of stopping and that his newly planted seeds are drowning in the fields. What he's witnessing is the collision between human survival and natural forces that care nothing for human plans or needs. The feudal system that governed Willem's life was built on predictable rhythms, the cycle of seasons, the reliable pattern of planting and harvest, the careful calculation of how much grain to keep, how much to plant, and how much to surrender to his lord. The New Yorker describes this as the basic bargain of feudal life. A peasant kept one part of his harvest for himself, put one part back into the ground for the next year's harvest, and gave the last part to his feudal lord. This three-way division had sustained European agriculture for centuries, but it depended on one crucial assumption, that there would be enough grain to divide. In villages across what is now France, Belgium, northern Germany, and the British Isles, peasants, like Willem, were making the same grim calculations. The rain continued through June, July, and into August. Fields that should have been golden with ripening grain remained underwater. The few crops that managed to grow were stunted, diseased, or rotted in the ground. The sweet smell of fermenting grain filled the air, not the pleasant aroma of brewing beer, but the sickly stench of waste and failed hopes. But the true horror of the situation wasn't immediately apparent. Peasant families had survived bad harvests before. They had stores of grain from the previous year, carefully rationed and hoarded against lean times. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't just a single bad harvest, it was the beginning of a pattern that would persist for years. B.U. Bridge explains that the crops failed and people started eating seed from the next harvest. Consider the mathematics of medieval survival. A typical peasant family needed about 8 bushels of grain per person per year just to survive. After a good harvest, they might have 12 bushels per person, leaving them with 4 bushels to divide between their lord's share and seed for the next year. But when the harvest failed completely, they faced an impossible choice: starve now or eat the seed and guarantee starvation later. The rain of 1315 wasn't the gentle precipitation that farmers pray for. It was torrential, violent, and relentless. Chronicles from the period describe it as water from heaven that would not cease, and speak of rivers overflowing their banks, mills destroyed by flooding, and roads becoming impassable. The very infrastructure of medieval life began to break down under the weight of constant moisture. In the village church, where Willem and his neighbors gathered each Sunday, the priest struggled to explain this catastrophe. Medieval Christianity had ready explanations for disaster, divine judgment for sin, the work of the devil, or the approach of the end times. But the sheer scale and persistence of the crisis challenged simple theological explanations. Some blamed witches, leading to a spike in witch trials that the New Yorker notes accompanied the agricultural collapse. In a world without scientific understanding of weather patterns, supernatural explanations seemed as reasonable as any other. The social order that had seemed so stable began to show cracks. Lords who had expected their customary portion of the harvest found themselves facing empty-handed peasants who had nothing to give. The feudal contract, based on mutual obligation and predictable agricultural surplus, started to collapse. Some lords showed mercy, reducing their demands or opening their own stores to feed starving peasants. Others, faced with their own economic pressures, demanded their full share regardless of the circumstances. As summer turned to autumn, and the autumn of 1315 proved as wet and miserable as the spring and summer had been, the full scope of the disaster became clear. This wasn't just a local crisis affecting Willem's village or even his region. From Ireland to Poland, from Scotland to the edge of the Mediterranean, the same story was playing out. The rains had failed to produce crops across a vast swathe of northern Europe, creating a food crisis of unprecedented scale. The price of grain, where it could be found at all, began to rise dramatically. In normal times, a bushel of wheat might cost a few pennies. By the autumn of 1315, it was selling for 10 times that amount, if it was available at all. Peasants who had never used money in their daily lives, who had operated entirely within the feudal economy of labor and payment in kind, suddenly found themselves forced to participate in a cash economy that few of them understood. But what does it mean to say that grain prices rose? For Willem and his neighbors, it meant that the old certainties of life had vanished. It meant that the social bonds that had held their community together, the obligation of the lord to protect his peasants, the expectation that hard work would be rewarded with survival, were dissolving in the face of scarcity. It meant that neighbors might become competitors, and that the struggle for survival might override the Christian charity that was supposed to govern their relationships. As winter approached and the reality of the food shortage became undeniable, European peasants faced a question that would haunt them for years to come. How long can a person survive on hope, prayer, and the diminishing contents of their grain stores? The answer, as the coming months would prove, was not long enough. The winter of 1315-1316 taught European peasants a mathematics more precise and terrible than any scholar's calculations, the exact arithmetic of starvation. Willem, our Dutch farmer, had entered the cold months with what he thought was enough grain to last until spring. By January, he was measuring his family's survival in handfuls of barley, counting and recounting the remaining stores with the obsessive precision of a man who knows that a single miscalculation means death. Medieval peasants were no strangers to hunger. The gap between harvests, what historians call the hunger season, was a regular feature of rural life, typically lasting from late winter through early summer when the new crops ripened. But the hunger season of 1316 was different. It wasn't the familiar tightening of belts and careful rationing of familiar hardship. It was the slow, grinding realization that the food was simply gone and that spring would bring no relief. B.U. Bridge tells us that people started eating seed from the next harvest. This simple statement conceals a decision so desperate that it defied every instinct of agricultural survival. Seed grain was sacred. It was the future, the promise of next year's harvest, the bridge between this year's hunger and next year's hope. To eat seed grain was to mortgage the future for the present, to choose survival today over the possibility of food tomorrow. Willem's family made this terrible choice in February 1316. They had been surviving on progressively smaller rations, mixing their remaining barley with whatever they could find: acorns, chestnuts, the inner bark of trees, even grass and leaves boiled into a bitter, barely nutritious soup. But human beings cannot survive indefinitely on such substitutes. The body needs protein, fats, and carbohydrates in quantities that foraged foods simply cannot provide. The process of starvation follows a predictable pattern that medieval peasants came to know intimately. First comes the constant gnawing of hunger, the stomach's angry protests against its emptiness. Then the body begins to consume itself, starting with fat stores, then muscle tissue, then organs. The starving person becomes weak, then lethargic, then begins to suffer from the diseases that accompany malnutrition: scurvy, rickets, dysentery. The immune system fails, making the victim susceptible to infections that a healthy person would easily survive. But starvation is not just a physical process, it's also a social one. As food becomes scarce, the bonds that hold communities together begin to strain and break. Families that had shared resources for generations began to hoard their remaining food. Neighbors who had helped each other through difficult times became suspicious and secretive. The Christian obligation to feed the hungry came into conflict with the parental duty to keep one's own children alive. Records from the period, preserved in monastic chronicles and manor court rolls, tell us that the breakdown of social order was swift and widespread. Theft became common as desperate people stole food from their neighbors. Begging, traditionally limited to the genuinely disabled, became a mass phenomenon as entire families took to the roads in search of sustenance. The rural population, traditionally tied to the land by feudal obligations, became mobile in ways that challenged the very foundations of medieval society. The response of the authorities reveals the inadequacy of existing institutions to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. Local lords, themselves facing reduced income from their starving peasants, had limited resources to offer relief. The church, which had traditionally provided charity to the poor, found its own stores depleted and its income reduced. Kings and princes, accustomed to extracting wealth from their subjects, discovered that there was no wealth to extract from a starving population. Some rulers attempted to address the crisis through regulation and price controls. They banned the export of grain, hoping to keep what little food remained within their territories. They set maximum prices for bread, trying to prevent profiteering. But these measures often backfired, creating black markets and driving food trade underground. The medieval economy, built on local production and consumption, was simply not equipped to handle the logistics of moving food from areas of plenty to areas of scarcity. The urban populations, typically better protected from agricultural crises, found themselves facing their own version of the catastrophe. Cities like Paris, London, and Florence depended on a regular supply of grain from the surrounding countryside. When that supply was interrupted, urban food prices skyrocketed. Bread riots became common as hungry crowds attacked bakers and grain merchants. The social order that had seemed so stable began to crack under the pressure of empty stomachs and rising prices. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the Great Famine was its impact on families. Parents faced the impossible choice of which children to feed when there wasn't enough food for everyone. Some families abandoned their weakest members, infants, elderly relatives, or disabled family members, hoping that reducing the number of mouths to feed would increase the chances of survival for the rest. Others held together through the crisis, sharing their meager resources equally and facing starvation as a family unit. Contemporary accounts speak of parents selling their children into servitude in exchange for food, or of children leaving home to reduce the burden on their families. The normal patterns of family life, the expectation that parents would care for children and children would care for elderly parents, were disrupted by the simple reality that there wasn't enough food to sustain the traditional family structure. Famine also revealed the vulnerability of the reproductive cycle. Malnourished women stopped menstruating, making conception difficult or impossible. Pregnant women who did conceive often miscarried, and those who carried their pregnancies to term frequently delivered stillborn infants or babies who died within days of birth. The birth rate plummeted just as the death rate soared, creating a demographic crisis that would affect European population patterns for generations. As the winter of 1316 gave way to spring, the survivors faced yet another crisis. The wet weather that had destroyed the 1315 harvest continued into 1316. The few peasants who had managed to save seed grain found it rotting in the waterlogged fields. Even those who had been careful, who had sacrificed to preserve their seed, discovered that the climate itself was working against them. The rains that had begun in May 1315 continued through 1316 and into 1317, creating a cascade of failed harvests that would define the decade. The survivors of the Great Famine, those who lived through the worst years of 1315, 1317, would carry the memory of those terrible winters for the rest of their lives. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the arithmetic of starvation, about the terrible choices that hunger forces upon families, about the fragility of the systems that sustain human life. But they would also tell them something else, that somehow, against all odds, life continued, that even in the darkest times people found ways to survive, to hope, and to rebuild. The question that haunted survivors like Willem wasn't just how they had survived, but what lessons they should draw from their experience. Had the famine been a divine punishment for sin, a natural disaster, or something more fundamental, a sign that the world itself was changing in ways that their traditional knowledge and institutions couldn't address? By the spring of 1317, those who had survived the Great Famine faced a landscape transformed not just by the physical devastation of 3 years of failed harvests, but by the complete reorganization of European society. Willem, our Dutch peasant, stood in his waterlogged fields that May morning looking at soil that had been underwater for nearly 2 years straight. The decision before him was simple in its brutality. Plant the last handful of seed grain he had managed to save, knowing it would likely rot in the ground, or eat it and accept that this field, his family's sustenance for generations, would lie fallow for another year. The numbers tell the story of what Europe had endured. B.U. Bridge records that the famine of 1315 killed more than 1.5 million people, but statistics cannot capture the human reality of what that meant. Entire villages had been abandoned. Families that had worked the same land for centuries had simply disappeared. The rural population of Northern Europe had been reduced by an estimated 10–15%, and the survivors were scattered, weakened, and traumatized. Yet somehow, life persisted. In the late spring of 1317, the rains that had tormented Europe for over 2 years finally began to ease. Not completely, the Little Ice Age would continue to disrupt European weather patterns for centuries to come, but enough to allow a cautious optimism that crops might actually survive to harvest. This tentative hope was built on more than just wishful thinking. The survivors of the Great Famine had learned lessons in adaptation that would serve them and their descendants for generations. The most fundamental change was in the relationship between peasants and the land. Before the famine, European agriculture had been remarkably conservative, with farming techniques passed down virtually unchanged from generation to generation. The crisis had forced experimentation and innovation. Peasants learned to diversify their crops, planting multiple varieties of grain with different tolerances for wet weather. They developed new techniques for drainage, digging ditches and channels to carry away excess water. They learned to work with the climate rather than simply hoping it would conform to their expectations. But the social changes were even more profound than the agricultural ones. The New Yorker explains that the famine had led to a fundamental shift in the social order across Europe. The feudal system, based on the three-way division of grain between peasant, lord, and next year's seed, had broken down completely. In its place, a new economy was emerging, one based on money, trade, and market relationships rather than traditional obligations. This transformation wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was visible in every aspect of daily life. Peasants who had never handled coins before the famine were now forced to participate in cash markets to buy food. Lords who had traditionally received their income in grain and labor services were now collecting rent in money. The local economy, which had been largely self-sufficient, was being integrated into regional and even international trade networks. The town of Ypres, in what is now Belgium, provides a perfect example of these changes. Before the famine, Ypres had been a small market town, serving the local rural population. But the crisis had created new opportunities for merchants who could import grain from distant regions where the harvests had been better. By 1320, Ypres had become a major trading centre, importing grain from as far away as the Baltic Sea and southern France. The wealth generated by this trade transformed the town's physical appearance and social structure, creating a new class of prosperous merchants and skilled craftsmen. This economic transformation had profound implications for people like Willem. The old certainties of feudal life, the expectation that hard work would guarantee survival, the belief that local resources would be sufficient for local needs, had been shattered. In their place was a new world of opportunity and risk, where success depended on one's ability to adapt to changing circumstances and to participate in markets that extended far beyond the local village. The psychological impact of the famine was equally significant. Survivors carried with them a deep awareness of vulnerability that affected every aspect of their lives. They hoarded food obsessively, storing grain in multiple locations to guard against future crises. They diversified their economic activities, refusing to depend entirely on agriculture for survival. They formed new types of social bonds, not just the traditional kinship and feudal relationships, but commercial partnerships and mutual aid societies designed to provide support during times of crisis. Religious life was also transformed by the experience of the famine. The traditional Christian explanation for suffering, that it was God's punishment for sin, had been tested and found wanting. Entire communities of devout believers had starved to death, while some of the most sinful individuals had managed to survive. This led to new forms of religious expression, including mystical movements that emphasized direct personal experience of the divine rather than institutional religious authority. The demographic impact of the famine would be felt. for generations. The sharp reduction in population had created labor shortages that gave surviving peasants more bargaining power with their lords. Wages began to rise, and working conditions improved as lords competed for scarce workers. The rigid social hierarchy that had characterized medieval Europe began to loosen, creating new opportunities for social mobility. Yet the recovery was neither quick nor complete. The climate disruption that had caused the Great Famine was part of a larger pattern of cooling that would continue for centuries. Even as the worst of the crisis passed, European peasants continued to face harvest failures, food shortages, and economic disruption. The Little Ice Age would bring new challenges: the Black Death in the 1340s, the severe winter of 1407-1408, the Maunder minimum in the 17th century, each testing the adaptive capacity that had been forged in the crucible of 1315-1317. The survivors of the Great Famine passed down to their children and grandchildren not just the memory of hunger, but the knowledge of how to survive in an uncertain world. They taught them to save seed grain in multiple locations, to maintain diverse sources of income, to build relationships with traders and merchants who could provide food during times of scarcity. Most importantly, they taught them that survival required constant adaptation, that the world was always changing, and that the key to prosperity was flexibility rather than rigid adherence to tradition. By 1320, Willem's fields were producing again, though never quite as abundantly as they had before the crisis. His family had survived, but they were different people than they had been 5 years earlier. They were more cautious, more resourceful, more aware of their place in a larger world. They had learned that their survival depended not just on their own efforts, but on complex systems of trade, weather, and social organization that extended far beyond their local village. The Great Famine had ended, but the world it had created, a world where change was constant, where traditional certainties could not be trusted, where survival required constant adaptation, was the world that would define the rest of the Little Ice Age. In the depths of winter, when the wind howled around their cottage and the frost covered their windows, Willem's family would remember the lessons of 1315, 1317. They would count their grain stores, check their diverse sources of income, and prepare for whatever changes the future might bring. The Little Ice Age had taught them that the world was not stable, that climate could change, that societies could collapse and be rebuilt. In learning to survive the Great Famine, they had learned to survive in a world of perpetual change, a lesson that would prove invaluable in the centuries of crisis that lay ahead. In the winter of 1683, something extraordinary happened to the Thames, the great river that had been London's lifeline for over 1,000 years, the waterway that brought goods from across the world to the city's docks, the highway that connected the capital to the sea, transformed overnight into something entirely different. It became solid, not just frozen around the edges as rivers sometimes do in particularly cold winters, but frozen completely, from bank to bank, thick enough to support the weight of horses and carriages, substantial enough to become the foundation for an entirely new form of urban life. The Thames had frozen before, but never quite like this. Historic UK records that between 1607 and 1814 there were a total of 7 major frost fairs held on the frozen River Thames in the heart of London. But the winter of 1683-1684 was different. The cold was more severe, more persistent, and more complete than anyone in London could remember. The ice was thick enough not just to walk on, but to build on, to live on, to create an entire temporary city in the heart of the capital. National Geographic tells us that the cold conditions caused the River Thames to freeze over on multiple occasions, to the extent that frost fairs would spring up, with people playing soccer, watching bear baiting, or competing in archery contests amid a backdrop of stalls selling everything from hot chocolate to pies. But this description, while accurate, doesn't capture the full significance of what was happening. The frozen Thames wasn't just a curiosity or a temporary entertainment. It was a complete transformation of London's physical and economic geography. Consider the implications for someone like Thomas Waterman, a member of the Company of Watermen, one of the thousands of men who made their living rowing passengers and cargo up and down the Thames. Thomas had inherited his position from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. For generations, the Waterman family had depended on the Thames for their livelihood, ferrying passengers between the north and south banks, carrying goods from the docks to the warehouses, providing a vital transportation service in a city divided by water. On the morning of December 20th, 1683, Thomas woke to find his world transformed. The Thames, which had been his highway and his workplace for 30 years, had become a solid mass of ice. His boat, tied to its usual mooring, was frozen into the river like a fossil in stone. The water that had supported his family for generations had vanished, replaced by a strange new landscape that offered both catastrophe and opportunity. The freezing of the Thames was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern of extreme weather that had been affecting Europe for decades as the Little Ice Age reached one of its most severe phases. BBC Weather explains that winters in the Mini Ice Age were more severe than nowadays. The Thames
froze at least 20 times, sometimes for 2 months or more.
But the winter of 1683-1684 was exceptional even by the standards of the Little Ice Age. The cold had set in early in November, and it showed no signs of breaking. Day after day, the temperature remained below freezing. Night after night, the frost grew thicker and more permanent. The transformation began slowly. First, ice formed along the banks of the river, creating a narrow channel of flowing water in the center. Then, as the cold intensified, the ice began to spread inward. Chunks of ice, swept downstream by the current, began to jam against the piers of London Bridge, creating a dam that slowed the flow of water. The slower current froze more easily, and within days the entire river was solid, from Westminster to the Tower of London. For the people of London, this transformation was both wonderful and terrifying. The frozen Thames eliminated the barrier between the north and south sides of the city, creating new possibilities for trade and social interaction. But it also destroyed the livelihoods of everyone who depended on the river for their survival. The watermen, the dock workers, the shipbuilders, the merchants who imported goods by water, all found their occupations suddenly irrelevant. The response was remarkably swift and creative. Within days of the river freezing solid, entrepreneurs began to set up shops and stalls on the ice. The frozen Thames became a new commercial district with its own streets, its own businesses, and its own peculiar economy. National Geographic notes that the displaced watermen adapted because they would become shopkeepers on the ice and they wouldn't have to pay rent on the frozen Thames. This detail, that there was no rent to pay on the frozen river, reveals something important about the economics of the frost fair. The Thames belonged to the Crown, and the Crown had no mechanism for collecting rent on a frozen river. This created a brief period of economic freedom in the heart of one of Europe's most regulated cities. Anyone could set up a stall, open a shop, or start a business on the ice without paying the fees and licenses that would normally be required. The result was a carnival of commerce and entertainment that lasted for several weeks. The frozen Thames became London's most popular destination, attracting visitors from across the city and beyond. There were puppet shows and bull baiting, roasted chestnuts and mulled wine, bookstalls and gambling dens. Entire families would spend their Sundays walking on the ice, marveling at the strange new world that had appeared in the heart of their city. But the Frost Fair was more than just entertainment. It was also a demonstration of human adaptability in the face of natural disaster. The people of London had faced a crisis that could have paralyzed their city's economy and social life. Instead, they had transformed it into an opportunity, creating new forms of work, new types of entertainment, and new ways of using urban space. The social implications were profound. The frozen Thames brought together people who would normally never interact. Aristocrats rubbed shoulders with street vendors, foreign diplomats mingled with London craftsmen, and the rigid social hierarchies that normally governed London life were temporarily suspended. The ice created a genuinely democratic space where anyone with a few pennies could participate in the commercial and social life of the fair. The physical reality of the frozen Thames was extraordinary. Contemporary accounts describe ice thick enough to support printing presses, where entrepreneurs produced souvenir pamphlets commemorating the event. There were bowling alleys set up on the ice, complete with pins and balls. Ox roasting became a popular spectacle, with entire animals cooked over fires built directly on the frozen river. The ice was so thick and stable that it could support the weight of heavy wagons and even small buildings. Yet beneath this festive surface lay a deeper reality. The Thames was frozen because Europe was experiencing one of the coldest periods in recorded history. BBC History magazine records that the winter of 1684 was so severe that King Charles II authorized a charitable collection to which he himself contributed. The Frost Fair, for all its gaiety and innovation, was taking place against a backdrop of genuine hardship and suffering. The cold was killing people. In the slums of London, where poor families had little fuel for heating and inadequate clothing, hypothermia was claiming lives daily. The charitable collection organized by the Crown was a recognition that the extreme weather was not just an inconvenience, but a genuine humanitarian crisis. The same cold that created the wonder of the frozen Thames was also creating widows and orphans throughout the city. The Frost Fair lasted for 7 weeks, from late December 1683 to early February 1684, but even as Londoners celebrated this strange new world, they were aware that it was temporary. The ice that seemed so solid and permanent was actually a fragile thing, dependent on the continuation of the extreme cold that had created it. Everyone knew that eventually the weather would change, the ice would melt, and the Thames would return to its normal state. The question that haunted both the participants and the observers of the Frost Fair was simple. What would happen when the thaw came? The Frost Fair of 1683-1684 created something unprecedented in London's history, a completely new economic system that existed only on ice. Thomas Waterman, our displaced river pilot, had spent the first weeks of the freeze in despair, watching his livelihood disappear beneath several feet of solid ice. But as the Frost Fair developed, he began to see possibilities that the normal Thames had never offered. Without the need to pay rent, licensing fees, or guild dues, he could become an entrepreneur in ways that the regulated economy of normal London would never have permitted. The economics of the Frost Fair were fascinating precisely because they were so different from the normal commercial life of the city. Historic UK tells us that the frozen Thames created a unique commercial environment where anyone could set up a stall, open a shop, or start a business on the ice without paying the fees and licenses that would normally be required. This temporary suspension of the normal rules of commerce created opportunities for people who would never have been able to afford to establish businesses in the regular economy. Thomas decided to open a coffee house on the ice. Coffee was a relatively new beverage in London. The first coffee house had opened only 20 years earlier, in 1663, but it had quickly become popular among merchants, intellectuals, and anyone who wanted to participate in the new culture of public discussion and debate. The problem was that coffee houses were expensive to establish. They required licenses, substantial rent payments, and connection to the guild system that controlled most of London's commercial life. On the frozen Thames, Thomas could bypass all of these obstacles. He built a simple wooden structure on the ice, heated it with a brazier, and began serving coffee to Frost Fair visitors. The coffee beans he purchased from the same merchants, who supplied the established coffee houses in the city, but his overhead was a fraction of what they paid. No rent, no licenses, no guild dues, just the cost of materials and the labor of serving customers. The result was a coffee house that could serve the common people of London in ways that the regular establishments could not. Thomas charged half the price of his landlocked competitors and still made a healthy profit. His customers included watermen like himself, temporarily unemployed dock workers, street vendors, and artisans, people who would never have been able to afford the prices at the fashionable coffee houses in the city proper. But Thomas was just one of hundreds of entrepreneurs who had recognized the opportunity created by the frozen Thames. The Frost Fair developed its own streets, its own addresses, its own internal geography. There was Friesland Street, running parallel to the North Bank, and Cheapside on the ice, mimicking the famous commercial district in the city. There were bookstalls selling pamphlets about the Frost Fair itself, printers producing souvenir, cards that could be purchased and dated as proof of participation, and taverns serving hot food and warm drinks to visitors who came to see the spectacle. The most remarkable aspect of the Frost Fair's economy was its speed and efficiency. Within days of the river freezing solid, a complete commercial district had emerged. Suppliers had figured out how to transport goods onto the ice. Entrepreneurs had learned how to construct temporary buildings that could withstand the cold, and customers had adapted to the strange experience of shopping on a frozen river. The two normal processes of urban planning, licensing, and construction that might take months or years in the regular city were compressed into days on the ice. National Geographic notes that this rapid adaptation was not unique to London. Similar patterns of innovation and adaptation were occurring across Europe as communities learned to cope with the extreme weather of the Little Ice Age. But the Thames Frost Fair was unique in its scale and visibility. Here, in the heart of one of Europe's largest cities, thousands of people were witnessing a real-time demonstration of economic creativity and social adaptation. The Frost Fair also created new forms of social interaction. The rigid class distinctions that governed normal London life were temporarily suspended on the ice. Aristocrats and street vendors shared the same space, ate at the same food stalls, and participated in the same entertainments. The Earl of Clarendon was recorded as purchasing a mug of ale from the same vendor who served Thomas Waterman's coffee house customers. The frozen Thames had created a genuinely democratic space in a city that was normally highly stratified by class and wealth, but the Frost Fair was more than just a temporary suspension of social hierarchy. It was also a laboratory for new forms of urban life. The layout of the fair, with its systematic streets and organized commercial districts, demonstrated that Londoners could create functional urban space without the traditional tools of government, planning, and regulation. The success of the Frost Fair challenged assumptions about the necessity of bureaucratic control and suggested that commercial and social cooperation could emerge organically from necessity and opportunity. The entertainment industry that developed on the frozen Thames was equally innovative. Traditional forms of London entertainment, bear baiting, puppet shows, musical performances, were adapted to the unique conditions of the ice. But new forms of entertainment also emerged that were specific to the frozen river. Ice bowling became popular, with lanes marked out on the smooth ice surface. Skating, still a relatively new activity in England, became a major attraction as people discovered the pleasure of gliding across the vast frozen surface. The printing industry that developed on the ice was particularly remarkable. Entrepreneurs brought entire printing presses onto the frozen Thames, setting them up in temporary structures and producing souvenirs, pamphlets, and broadsides about the frost fair itself. These publications served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment for visitors, created lasting mementos of the extraordinary event, and generated income for the printers. Many of these frost fair publications have survived to the present day, providing historians with detailed accounts of daily life on the frozen river. The food and drink industry was perhaps the most essential component of the frost fair economy. Cooking on ice presented unique challenges. How do you maintain cooking fires on a frozen surface? How do you keep food warm in sub-freezing temperatures? How do you serve hot drinks when the containers themselves might freeze? The solutions developed by frost fair vendors were ingenious and practical. They built raised platforms for their fires, used specially designed braziers that could be safely operated on ice, and developed techniques for keeping food and drink warm in extreme conditions. The most popular food at the frost fair was roasted ox, entire animals cooked over open fires on the ice. The spectacle of ox roasting drew crowds and created gathering points around which other commercial activities clustered. The smell of roasting meat carried across the frozen river, serving as an advertisement and creating an atmosphere of festivity that drew more visitors to the fair. But the frost fair economy also had its darker aspects. The same cold that made the fair possible was also creating genuine hardship throughout London. While the wealthy could afford the novelty of shopping and eating on the frozen Thames, the poor were struggling to find fuel for heating and food for survival. The charitable collection organized by King Charles II was a recognition that the extreme weather was creating a humanitarian crisis alongside the commercial opportunity. The presence of gambling and less savory entertainments on the ice also reflected the temporary suspension of normal social controls. With no established authority governing the frost fair, activities that might have been regulated or prohibited in the normal city flourished on the ice. There were dice games, card games, and various forms of betting that attracted both participants and observers. The clothing industry also adapted to the unique conditions of the frost fair. Vendors sold warm clothing, special boots for walking on ice, and accessories designed for the extreme cold. The fashion of the frost fair developed its own characteristics, practical, warm, but also festive and celebratory. People dressed up to visit the fair, but they also dressed warmly, creating a unique style that combined necessity with entertainment. As the weeks passed, the frost fair developed its own culture and community. Regular visitors established favorite vendors and gathering places. Friendships formed among the entrepreneurs who worked side by side on the ice. A sense of shared adventure and mutual dependence developed among the thousands of people who participated in this temporary city. But everyone was aware that this extraordinary world existed only as long as the cold continued. The ice that seemed so solid and permanent was actually fragile and temporary. Every day that the fair continued was a gift from the weather, and every participant knew that eventually the inevitable thaw would wash away everything they had built. The question that hung over the entire enterprise was not whether the thaw would come, but when. And when it did come, what would happen to the people who had built their temporary livelihoods on the ice? What would happen to Thomas Waterman and his coffee house, to the printers and their presses, to the thousands of small entrepreneurs who had found opportunity in the frozen Thames? The thaw began on February 5th, 1684, with the sound of cracking that could be heard across London. Thomas Waterman was serving morning coffee in his ice-bound establishment when he heard it, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from the very foundations of the frozen Thames. He set down his coffee pot and listened, recognizing instinctively that this sound meant the end of everything he had built during the 7 extraordinary weeks of the frost fair. The end came more quickly than anyone had anticipated. The weather had been showing signs of change for several days. the daytime temperatures rising just above freezing, the night frosts becoming less severe. But the ice had seemed so thick, so permanent, that most people on the frost fair assumed they had at least another week or two before serious melting began. They were wrong. BBC History magazine records that when the Thames began to thaw, the ice broke up suddenly and dramatically, creating dangerous conditions for anyone still on
The river.
the process wasn't gradual or predictable. The ice didn't simply melt away slowly. Instead, it broke apart in massive chunks that were swept downstream by the returning current, creating a chaos of floating ice blocks, debris, and rushing water. Thomas had perhaps 15 minutes to save what he could from his coffee house. The groaning and cracking sounds were growing louder and more frequent, and he could see cracks appearing in the ice around his structure. Other entrepreneurs were already abandoning their stalls and shops, grabbing whatever portable goods they could carry, and heading for the safety of the riverbanks. The scene was both terrifying and heartbreaking. 7 weeks of commercial and social life were disappearing in a matter of hours. The printing presses that had produced thousands of souvenir pamphlets were too heavy to move quickly. Their operators could only watch as the ice beneath them began to shift and crack, threatening to dump expensive equipment into the Thames. Some printers managed to save their type and smaller tools, but the presses themselves were lost. The food vendors faced their own crisis. The braziers and cooking fires that had seemed so safe on solid ice became dangerous as the surface began to move. Several vendors were burned when their heating apparatus shifted unexpectedly. The elaborate ox roasting setups with their heavy spits and large fires had to be abandoned entirely. The smell of extinguished fires and abandoned food filled the air as people fled the disintegrating ice. But perhaps the most poignant losses were the social and cultural ones. The Frost Fair had created a temporary community that was disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. Friendships that had formed among vendors and regular customers were being severed by the simple reality that their shared space was dissolving. The democratic mixing of social classes that had characterized the Frost Fair was ending as everyone retreated to their normal lives and locations. Thomas managed to save his coffee supplies and some of his equipment, but his wooden structure was too large and too well built to be moved quickly. He watched from the safety of the north bank as the ice beneath his coffee house began to break apart. The building that had been his livelihood for 7 weeks tilted, then collapsed, then was swept away by the chunks of ice moving downstream. The human cost of the rapid thaw was significant. Several people who had lingered too long on the ice were caught by the breakup and swept into the frigid water. Some were rescued by quick-thinking observers on the banks, but others were lost too. The Thames, the very river that had provided such extraordinary opportunities during its frozen phase, reclaimed its traditional role as a dangerous and sometimes deadly force in London life. The aftermath of the Frost Fair revealed both the resilience and the vulnerability of London's economy and society. For some, like Thomas, the experience had been transformative. He had learned that he could be more than just a waterman. He could be an entrepreneur, a coffee house proprietor, a participant in London's intellectual and commercial life. The question was whether the skills and connections he had developed during the Frost Fair could be transferred to the normal world of unfrozen London. The answer, for Thomas and many others, was partly yes and partly no. The economic opportunities that had existed on the frozen Thames, the ability to establish a business without rent, licenses, or guild membership, disappeared with the ice. But the knowledge and experience gained during the Frost Fair proved valuable in other ways. Thomas used his savings from the coffee house to establish himself in the coal trade, bringing fuel to London during the remaining cold months of the Little Ice Age. Other Frost Fair veterans became involved in the growing commerce around coffee, chocolate, and other exotic goods that were becoming popular in London. The Frost Fair had also demonstrated the potential for new forms of urban space and social organisation. The success of the temporary city on the Thames inspired discussions about London's growth and development. Could the lessons learned on the ice, the efficiency of unregulated commerce, the benefits of mixed social interaction, the possibility of rapid urban development be applied to the expansion of the city on land? Some of these lessons were indeed incorporated into London's subsequent development. The coffee-house culture that had flourished on the ice continued to grow in the i.e. city proper, eventually becoming one of London's most distinctive social institutions. The experience of the Frost Fair had shown that there was a market for more democratic and accessible forms of entertainment and commerce, leading to changes in how London's entrepreneurs thought about their customers and their businesses. But the Frost Fair had also revealed the fundamental vulnerability of human endeavours to natural forces. The Little Ice Age wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The winter of 1683-1684 would be followed by many more years of extreme weather, failed harvests and social disruption. The Thames would freeze again, though never quite as completely, or for as long as it had in 1684. River Thames Frost Fairs records that most were held between the early 17th and early 19th centuries during the period known as the Little Ice Age, when the river froze over most often. The memory of the 1684 Frost Fair became part of London's collective consciousness, passed down through generations as both a wonderful story and a cautionary tale. It was wonderful because it demonstrated human creativity and adaptability in the face of natural disaster. It was cautionary because it reminded people of how quickly and completely the natural world could transform the human environment. For Thomas Waterman and the thousands of others who had participated in the Frost Fair, the experience became a defining moment in their lives. They had lived through something extraordinary, a time when the normal rules of life had been suspended, when new possibilities had emerged from disaster, when the rigid structures of society had temporarily given way to something more fluid and democratic. But they had also learned that such moments were temporary and fragile. The ice that had seemed so solid and permanent had proved to be as ephemeral as frost on a window. The community that had formed on the frozen Thames had dispersed as quickly as it had gathered. The economic opportunities that had emerged from the crisis had vanished with the returning river. The lesson of the Frost Fair was not that disaster always creates opportunity, but that human beings have a remarkable capacity to adapt, innovate, and create meaning even in the most challenging circumstances. The people of London had faced a crisis that could have paralyzed their city. Instead, they had transformed it into one of the most memorable and creative episodes in the city's history. As Thomas stood on the riverbank, watching the last chunks of ice float downstream toward the sea, he carried with him the memory of 7 weeks when anything had seemed possible. The Thames was returning to its normal state. London was returning to its normal rhythms, and life was returning to its normal constraints. But the knowledge that those constraints were not permanent, that crisis could create opportunity, and that human creativity could transform disaster into celebration, that knowledge would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Little Ice Age would continue for centuries more, bringing new challenges and new opportunities for adaptation. The Frost Fair of 1684 had shown one way that people could respond to the changing climate. As the cold years continued, Londoners and Europeans everywhere would need to draw on that same spirit of creativity, adaptability, and community cooperation that had created a temporary city on the frozen Thames. In the village of Goms, nestled high in the Swiss Alps at an elevation where the air grows thin and the growing season never lasts more than 4 months, even in good years, Maria Zurbriggen knelt in her kitchen garden on an August morning in 1692, counting potato plants. Not counting potatoes, those wouldn't be ready for harvest for another month, but counting the plants themselves, calculating whether she had enough growing to keep her family alive through the coming winter. The mathematics of survival at altitude are unforgiving. National Geographic tells us that alpine villagers during the Little Ice Age were living on bread made from ground nutshells mixed with barley and oat flour. But this stark description doesn't capture the complex calculations that went into such desperate adaptations, or the intricate knowledge systems that alpine communities had developed over centuries to survive in one of Europe's most challenging environments. Maria's potato plants looked stunted and yellowed, victims of the cold, wet summer that had characterized the 1690s throughout the Alps. This was the 5th consecutive year of poor harvests, part of what historians now recognize as one of the most severe phases of the Little Ice Age. The Maunder minimum, a period of reduced solar activity that lasted from roughly 1645 to 1715, was creating weather patterns that challenged even the most experienced mountain farmers. The village of Goms sits at nearly 4,500 feet above sea level, high enough that frost can occur in any month of the year. Even in normal times, the margin for error in alpine agriculture was razor thin. The growing season was short, the soil was poor, and the weather was unpredictable. A single late frost could destroy an entire season's work. A week of cold rain during harvest time could mean the difference between survival and starvation for an entire community. But the 1690s were not normal times. The climate disruption caused by the Little Ice Age had pushed alpine agriculture beyond its normal limits. Villages that had sustained themselves for centuries were facing harvest failures year after year. The traditional crops that had formed the backbone of mountain agriculture, barley, oats, and the newly introduced potato, were struggling to ripen in the shortened growing seasons and cooler temperatures. Maria's husband, Hans, had already left for the valleys below, seeking work in the cheese-making operations that served markets in the growing cities of northern Italy and southern Germany. This seasonal migration, alpine wandering as it was called, had always been part of life in the high villages. But in the 1690s the migration was becoming more permanent, as men left to find work that could support their families when the mountains could no longer provide. The social structure of alpine villages was uniquely adapted to the challenges of mountain life. These were not feudal communities in the traditional sense. The high Alps had never been fully integrated into the medieval manor system because the land was too poor and the conditions too harsh to support the kind of agricultural surplus that feudalism required. Instead, alpine villages operated as collective communities where survival depended on cooperation, shared labor, and the careful management of common resources. Maria was part of an extended family group that included her elderly mother-in-law, Anna, and her 3 children, Klaus, age 12, Margaretha, age 9, and little Johann, just 4 years old. 3 generations of women and children trying to survive on the produce of a garden that was failing and the contents of a grain store that had been depleted by 4 previous years of poor harvests. The grain store was the heart of alpine survival strategy. Every family maintained carefully hidden caches of grain, stored in multiple locations to guard against theft, fire, or discovery by tax collectors from the valleys below. The grain was treated almost like sacred objects, counted regularly, protected jealously, and consumed only according to strict calculations designed to make it last until the next harvest. But by August 1692, Maria's grain stores were nearly empty. The barley and oats that should have sustained her family through the winter had been consumed during the previous lean years. The The bread that had once been made from pure grain flour was now extended with whatever could be found: acorns, chestnuts, the inner bark of pine trees, and yes, as National Geographic records, ground nutshells mixed with barley and oat flour. The process of making bread from nutshells was labor-intensive and required knowledge that had been passed down through generations of alpine women. Walnut shells had to be dried completely, then ground to a fine powder using stone mills. The powder was bitter and virtually indigestible unless properly prepared. It had to be mixed with whatever grain flour was available in precise proportions. Too much nutshell powder and the bread became impossible to eat. Too little, and it provided no real nutritional value. But even this desperate food could only be made if there were nuts to harvest. The walnut trees that grew in the protected valleys around Goms had also been affected by the climate change. The cold summers and late frosts of the 1690s had reduced nut production just when it was most needed. Maria and her neighbors were competing with squirrels and birds for nuts that were smaller and fewer than in previous years. The psychological impact of this constant hunger was as significant as the physical effects. Alpine communities had always prided themselves on their self-sufficiency and their ability to survive in harsh conditions. The failure of their traditional survival strategies created not just hunger, but a crisis of confidence and identity. How could people who had survived in the mountains for centuries suddenly find themselves unable to feed their children? The answer lay partly in the unprecedented nature of the climate change they were experiencing. The Little Ice Age was not just a temporary cold spell, it was a fundamental shift in weather patterns that lasted for centuries. BBC History magazine notes that parts of the 17th and early 18th centuries were especially brutal, with several European nations undergoing major famines in the late 1600s. But alpine communities couldn't wait for historians to explain what was happening to them. They had to develop new survival strategies immediately. Maria and her neighbors began to experiment with new crops that might be more tolerant of cold and wet conditions. They extended their foraging activities, learning to identify and prepare plants that previous generations had ignored. They modified their food storage techniques, trying to make their limited supplies last longer. The religious dimension of survival in the Alps was also crucial. Maria's family attended Mass every Sunday in the village church, where the priest struggled to explain why God was testing his faithful with such persistent hardship. The Catholic Church had traditional explanations for suffering: divine punishment for sin, tests of faith, preparation for salvation. But the scale and duration of the crisis challenged simple theological answers. Some villagers turned to folk beliefs and practices that predated Christianity in the Alps. They consulted local wise women who claimed to understand the signs and portents that might predict weather patterns. They performed rituals designed to ensure good harvests and protect their families from starvation. The boundaries between Christian and pagan beliefs became blurred as people searched desperately for any source of hope or practical guidance. The children in villages like Goms grew up with hunger as a constant companion. Klaus, Maria's 12-year-old son, was small for his age, stunted by years of inadequate nutrition. Margareta had learned to ignore the constant gnawing in her stomach and to help her mother with the complex tasks of foraging and food preparation. Little Johann cried frequently, though whether from hunger, cold, or simple childhood distress was often impossible to determine. But alpine children were also learning skills that would serve them throughout their lives. They learned to identify edible plants and nuts, to judge the ripeness of crops, to calculate food supplies and ration them carefully. They learned the geography of survival, which valleys offered the best foraging, which slopes caught the most sun, which streams were most likely to freeze in winter. By September 1692, as the first frost began to appear on the high peaks above, Goms Maria faced the most difficult decision of her life. The potato harvest had been worse than she had feared. The few vegetables in her garden would not last beyond October. The walnut harvest had been disappointing. Her grain stores were virtually empty. She could try to make it through another winter in the mountains, relying on increasingly desperate food sources and hoping that the spring of 1693 would bring better weather and successful crops. Or she could take her children and follow her husband down to the valleys, abandoning the village and the way of life that her family had maintained for generations. It was a choice that thousands of Alpine families were making in the 1690s, and the consequences would reshape the demographics and culture of the entire region. But for Maria, standing in her failed garden as the first snow began to fall on the peaks above her village, the choice was immediate and personal. How long can hope sustain life when the cupboards are empty and winter is coming? By October 1692, the village of Goms had developed what could only be called an architecture of desperation. Every building, every room, every storage space had been repurposed for the single goal of stretching insufficient resources through an impossibly long winter. Maria Zurbriggen's cottage, which had once reflected the prosperity of a successful mountain farming family, now resembled a complex machine designed for the precise rationing of survival. The transformation had begun years earlier, as the successive harvest failures of the late 1680s and early 1690s forced Alpine families to reorganize their domestic spaces around scarcity rather than abundance. The main room of Maria's cottage, which had traditionally served as kitchen, dining area, and social space, had been subdivided with hanging cloths and wooden partitions to create smaller areas that could be heated more efficiently. The large communal table where the family had once gathered for meals had been moved against the wall to make room for additional storage containers. But it was the proliferation of hiding places that most clearly revealed the psychological impact of chronic
Hunger.
Every cottage in Goms now contained dozens of carefully concealed food caches, small amounts of grain hidden under floorboards, behind loose stones in the walls, in the rafters, even buried in earthenware pots beneath the kitchen floor. This multiplication of storage sites served both practical and emotional purposes. Practically, it guarded against the catastrophic loss of all food supplies to theft, fire, or confiscation. Emotionally, it allowed families to maintain the illusion that they had more food than they actually possessed. Maria's mother-in-law, Anna, had become the family's keeper of hidden stores. At 67 years old, Anna had lived through enough lean years to understand the psychology of famine survival. She knew that the knowledge of where food was hidden needed to be shared among family members, but not too widely and not all at once. If everyone knew the location of every cache, the temptation to consume the stores too quickly would be overwhelming. If no one but Anna knew where the food was hidden, her death would doom the entire family. So Anna had developed an elaborate system of graduated knowledge. Maria knew the locations of enough caches to feed the family for perhaps 2 weeks. Klaus, the eldest child, knew of additional stores that could sustain them for another week. Margaretha and little Johann were kept ignorant of the full extent of the family's resources, not from lack of trust, but from the understanding that children under extreme stress might not be able to resist the temptation to consume everything. Immediately, the actual contents of these hidden stores revealed the creative desperation of Alpine survival. Along with the traditional grains, barley, oats, and small amounts of wheat, the caches contained substances that would have been unimaginable as human food in better times. Acorns, carefully processed to remove their bitter tannins, comprised a significant portion of the family's carbohydrate reserves. Pine nuts, laboriously gathered from the high slopes above the village, provided essential fats. The inner bark of certain trees, dried and ground into flour, extended the grain supplies, but perhaps the most ingenious adaptation was the systematic cultivation of what Alpine villagers called famine foods. plants that could survive in poor soil and cold conditions even if they provided minimal nutrition. Nettle gardens, carefully tended patches of stinging nettles that could be boiled into soup, occupied corners of every cottage garden. Wild garlic, which grew naturally in the mountain meadows but could be encouraged and protected, provided flavor and some vitamins for the otherwise monotonous diet. National Geographic mentions that alpine communities were living on bread made from ground nutshells mixed with barley and oat flour. But this description doesn't capture the sophisticated knowledge required to make such bread edible, nutritious, or even safe. The preparation of nutshell flour was a skill that had been developed through generations of experimentation and had been refined to a precise science during the crisis years of the 1690s. The process began with the collection of walnut shells, which had to be completely cleaned of any remaining nut meat to prevent rancidity. The shells were then dried for several weeks, either in the sun during the brief alpine summer or in the warmth near the cottage hearth during colder months. Once thoroughly dried, the shells were ground using stone querns, small hand mills, that had been used in the Alps for centuries to process grain. But grinding walnut shells produced a powder that was nearly indigestible in its raw form. The cellulose fibers were too tough for human digestive systems to break down effectively. Alpine women had learned that the nutshell flour needed to be treated with lye made from wood ash to break down the fibers and make them digestible. This process was dangerous if done incorrectly, as too much lye could poison the entire batch of flour. Too little lye left the nutshells indigestible. The lye treatment was followed by repeated washing to remove the caustic chemicals, then careful drying and regrinding to achieve the proper consistency. When mixed with whatever grain flour was available, the processed nutshell flour could comprise up to half of the bread dough without making it completely inedible. The resulting bread was dark, dense, and bitter, but it provided calories and fiber that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The social organization required to implement these survival strategies was as complex as the technical knowledge. Villages like Goms operated sophisticated sharing networks that allowed families to pool their resources and knowledge while maintaining the individual hoarding that psychological research has shown to be essential for survival during extreme scarcity. Women like Maria and Anna formed informal councils that met regularly to share information about foraging opportunities, food processing techniques, and the management of family resources. These councils operated according to rules that had evolved over generations of alpine survival. Information about individual family food stores was never shared directly. That would create opportunities for theft and resentment. But general information about successful foraging locations, effective processing techniques, and seasonal timing was freely exchanged. The councils also served as early warning systems, alerting the community when any family was approaching complete destitution and needed emergency assistance. The children of Goms were integrated into this survival network in ways that would have been unthinkable in more prosperous times. Klaus, at 12, was responsible for daily foraging expeditions that might take him miles from the village in search of edible plants, nuts, or berries. Margaretha, despite being only 9, had learned the complex procedures for processing acorns and pine nuts. Even little Johann contributed to family survival by helping to gather kindling and maintain the carefully banked fires that were essential for food processing and warmth. But the most remarkable aspect of this survival architecture was its psychological dimension. The elaborate systems of food storage, processing, and sharing served not just to extend limited supplies, but to maintain the illusion of control and agency in a situation where families were essentially helpless against forces far beyond their understanding. The careful rationing, the hidden caches, the complex processing procedures, all of these activities allowed people to feel that they were doing something meaningful to ensure their survival, even when the fundamental problem was beyond their ability to solve. The religious life of the village had also been reorganized around the crisis. Sunday masses had become community meetings where information was shared and mutual aid organized. The priest, Father Benedict, had modified traditional prayers to include specific requests for relief from hunger and protection from the harsh weather. The church had become a storage site for the community's emergency food supplies, small amounts contributed by each family and held in reserve for the most desperate circumstances. But by November 1692, even these carefully constructed survival systems were beginning to fail. The early onset of winter weather had shortened the foraging season and reduced the wild food supplies that families had counted on to supplement their stored provisions. The first snows had come in October, nearly a month earlier than normal, and the cold had been more severe than anyone could remember. Maria stood in her cottage one grey November morning, counting and recounting the contents of her food stores, trying to calculate whether they would last until spring. The mathematics were unforgiving. Even with the most careful rationing, even if they consumed nothing but the minimal calories required to prevent starvation, their supplies would be exhausted by February, and spring, if it came at all, would not arrive until May. The architecture of desperation that had sustained the village through 4 years of hardship was finally proving inadequate to the challenge. As Maria looked out her small window at the snow already accumulating on the village roofs, she faced the question that haunted every family in Goms. Was survival possible, or had they simply been postponing the inevitable? Spring came late to Goms in 1693, but it came. On a morning in early May, when Maria Zurbriggen had given up hope of seeing another season, she woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves of her cottage. For the first time in 7 months, the temperature had risen above freezing and stayed there long enough for the accumulated snow and ice to begin melting. She lay in her bed, listening to that steady drip, 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 hardly daring to believe that winter was finally ending. The survival of the village through the winter of 1692-1693 had required more than careful planning and resourceful food processing. It had required what could only be called a miracle of human cooperation and determination. Of the 43 families that had entered the winter in Goms, 37 had survived until spring. The 6 families that had been lost, 18 people in total, had died not of starvation alone, but of the diseases that accompany malnutrition, typhus, pneumonia, and what the villagers simply called the wasting sickness. But 37 families had survived, including Maria's. Her mother-in-law Anna had died in February, quietly and without complaint, during a week of particularly severe cold. Anna's death had been both a tragedy and a brutal necessity. One fewer mouth to feed during the most desperate period of the winter. Maria had found herself taking on Anna's role as keeper of the hidden food stores, learning the locations of caches that she had never known existed, discovering that the old woman had been more far-sighted and better prepared than anyone had realized. The children had survived, though they bore the permanent marks of their ordeal. Klaus, now 13, was permanently stunted by years of malnutrition. Medical knowledge of the time did not include an understanding of the long-term effects of childhood hunger, but Maria could see that her son would never achieve the height and strength that his father possessed. Margaretha, now 10, had developed the quiet, watchful demeanor of a child who had learned that resources were precious and survival was never guaranteed. Little Johann, remarkably, seemed to have suffered the least physical damage, perhaps because he had been too young to understand the full scope of the crisis. The survival strategies that had sustained the village through the crisis years had transformed Alpine culture permanently. The knowledge of how to process nutshell flour, how to make bread from acorn meal, how to identify and prepare dozens of wild plants for human consumption, all of this information had been systematized and passed down to the next generation, with the kind of care usually reserved for religious doctrine. Children who had grown up during the famine years would carry this knowledge with them for the rest of their lives, creating a more resilient and adaptable mountain culture. But the most significant change was in the relationship between alpine villages and the outside world. The crisis had forced communities like Goms to become integrated into larger economic networks in ways that would have been unimaginable before the Little Ice Age. The seasonal migration that had once involved a few young men seeking temporary work in the valleys below had become a permanent exodus of entire families. Hans Zurbriggen had not returned to Goms for the winter of 1692-1693, instead establishing himself as a cheesemaker in the growing city of Bern, sending what money he could back to his family in the mountain. National Geographic describes how various communities developed resilient trading culture and decentralized trading networks to survive the Little Ice Age. The alpine villages were part of this larger pattern of adaptation, though their integration into trading networks was often forced by desperation rather than chosen for opportunity. The spring of 1693 brought the return of some of the men who had left for the valleys, but also the recognition that the traditional pattern of mountain life had been permanently altered. Villages like Goms would never again be completely self-sufficient. They would always depend, to some degree, on their connections to the larger European economy for their survival. The agricultural recovery was slow and incomplete. The late spring meant a shortened growing season, and years of poor nutrition had weakened the villagers' ability to perform the heavy labor that mountain farming required. But Maria and her neighbors approached the 1693 planting season with a sophistication and caution that their ancestors had never possessed. They planted multiple varieties of crops with different tolerances for cold and wet conditions. They maintained larger and more diverse food stores than had ever been considered necessary. They continued to gather and process wild foods even when their gardens were producing adequately. The religious life of the village had also been transformed by the experience of near starvation. Father Benedict, who had guided the community through the worst years of the crisis, had developed a theology that emphasized practical charity and mutual aid alongside traditional Catholic doctrine. The church had become not just a place of worship, but a center for community organization and resource sharing. Sunday services included discussions of agricultural techniques, weather prediction, and survival strategies that would have been considered inappropriate in more prosperous times. But perhaps the most profound change was in the psychology of survival itself. The people of Goms had learned that their traditional ways of life, developed over centuries of mountain living, were not adequate to protect them against the kind of climate change they had experienced. They had been forced to become innovators and experimenters, constantly adapting their techniques and strategies to meet new challenges. This new mindset proved valuable as the Little Ice Age continued. The severe winter of 1692-1693 was followed by other difficult years, though none quite as desperate as what the village had just survived. The summer of 1695 was cold and wet, resulting in another partial harvest failure. The winter of 1697-1698 was exceptionally long, with snow remaining on the ground until June. But the villagers who had survived the crisis of the early 1690s met these challenges with the confidence of people who had tested their limits and found ways to endure. The children who had grown up during the famine years became adults with a different relationship to scarcity and abundance than their parents had possessed. They were more careful with resources, more inventive in their use of marginal foods, more willing to adapt their practices to changing circumstances. When Klaus Zurbriggen inherited his family's cottage and gardens in 1710, he immediately implemented improvements that reflected the lessons learned during his childhood: more diversified crops, better food storage facilities, and stronger connections to the trading networks that could provide emergency supplies during times of crisis. The story of Goms during the 1690s was repeated in hundreds of alpine villages throughout Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy. Each community developed its own variations on the themes of adaptation and survival, but all shared the experience of being forced to reinvent their relationship with their environment and with each other. The Little Ice Age had challenged the assumption that human communities could remain static and isolated, forcing a recognition that survival often required connection, adaptation, and change. By the summer of 1693, as Maria worked in her gardens and watched her children help with the harvest, she carried with her the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed, that traditional ways could fail, and that human beings possessed a remarkable capacity to adapt and endure. The village of Goms had survived its greatest trial, but it had also been permanently transformed by the experience. The nutshell bread that had sustained them through the worst months was still being made occasionally, not from necessity now, but as a reminder of what they had endured and overcome. And the hidden food caches remained in place, carefully maintained and regularly checked. The networks of mutual aid and information sharing that had developed during the crisis continued to operate, creating a more resilient and cooperative community than had existed before the famine years. As autumn approached and the villagers began their preparations for another winter, they did so with the confidence of people who had faced the worst and survived. They had learned that the mountains could be cruel and unforgiving, but they had also learned that human beings could be remarkably resourceful and resilient when necessity demanded it. The Little Ice Age would continue for more than a century, after the crisis of the 1690s, bringing new challenges and requiring new adaptations. But the people of Goms and hundreds of similar mountain communities had developed the skills, knowledge, and social organization that would allow them to meet those challenges successfully. They had learned to survive not just on the abundance of good years, but on the creativity, cooperation, and determination that could sustain life even in the darkest times. The miracle of spring 1693 was not just that the snow had melted and the growing season had returned. The miracle was that human communities had proven capable of reinventing themselves, of finding new ways to live and thrive in a world that had changed dramatically and permanently. In learning to survive on nutshells and hope, the people of the Alps had discovered something fundamental about human resilience that would serve them well in the centuries of change that lay ahead. The sound of water dripping from the eaves that had awakened Maria on that first warm morning of spring would remain with her for the rest of her life, not just as a memory of relief from a terrible winter, but as a reminder that even the longest darkness eventually gives way to light, that even the most desperate circumstances can be survived with courage, creativity, and the support of community. In the end, that knowledge proved to be as valuable
as any harvest, as sustaining as any bread, as reliable as any store of grain, hidden against the uncertainty of an unpredictable world.
In the summer of 1675, Jean-Baptiste Colbert stood at the window of his chateau in Seignelay, watching his workers move through wheat fields that should have been golden with grain ready for harvest, but instead remained stubbornly green and unripened despite the calendar showing late August. As Louis XIV's Controller General of Finances, Colbert was accustomed to managing the complex logistics of feeding the largest kingdom in Europe. But the pattern of failed harvests that had persisted throughout the 1670s was creating challenges that traditional administrative solutions could not address. What Colbert was witnessing was the agricultural manifestation of one of the most significant climate events in recorded history. the Maunder minimum, a period of drastically reduced solar activity that lasted from approximately 1645 to 1715. Britannica defines this as an unexplained period of drastically reduced sunspot activity that occurred between 1645 and 1715. But the dry scientific description cannot capture the human reality of what it meant to live through 70 years of disrupted weather patterns, failed harvests, and social upheaval. The Maunder minimum was named after Edward Walter Maunder, the English astronomer, who first identified the pattern in the late 19th century by analyzing historical records of sunspot observations. But the people living through it in the 17th century had no understanding of solar cycles or their relationship to terrestrial weather. They only knew that something fundamental had changed in the natural order, and that the agricultural systems that had sustained European civilization for centuries were no longer reliable. Kolber's wheat fields in Burgundy were failing for the same reason that crops were failing from Scotland to Sicily, from Ireland to Poland. NASA science explains that the largest recent event, the Maunder minimum, which lasted from 1645 and 1715, overlapped with the Little Ice Age. The reduction in solar output during this period was relatively small, perhaps 0.25% less, energy reaching Earth, but the effects on regional weather patterns were dramatic and persistent. The summer of 1675 was particularly severe. Across northern Europe, temperatures remained several degrees below normal throughout the growing season. The jet stream, influenced by the reduced solar input, had shifted southward, bringing Arctic air masses deep into continental Europe and creating weather patterns that seemed to defy all traditional understanding of seasonal cycles. In Jean-Baptiste's fields, the wheat that should have been hardening and ripening in the August sun remained soft and green, vulnerable to the fungal diseases that thrived in the cool, wet conditions. The barley was even worse. Much of it had never properly headed out, remaining as green stalks that would provide neither grain for human consumption nor adequate straw for animal fodder. The oats, typically the most reliable crop in northerny climates, had been beaten down by weeks of cold rain and showed little prospect of recovery. But the crisis extended far beyond individual crop failures. The French agricultural system of the 17th century was a complex network of interconnected relationships between peasant farmers, noble landowners, urban merchants, and royal administrators. The system depended on predictable agricultural surplus to support not just the rural population, but the growing cities, the royal court, the military, and the elaborate bureaucracy that managed the kingdom's affairs. When harvests failed repeatedly, as they had been doing throughout the 1670s, the entire system began to break down. Peasants who could not produce enough grain to meet their obligations to their lords were forced to abandon their holdings. Lords who could not collect their customary rents faced their own financial crises. Urban populations dependent on rural grain production faced rising food prices and periodic shortages. The royal treasury, which depended on agricultural taxes for much of its revenue, found itself dealing simultaneously with reduced income and increased demands for emergency relief. Colbert understood these systemic problems better than most of his contemporaries. As Controller General, he had access to reports from royal administrators throughout France detailing the scope and persistence of the agricultural crisis. The reports painted a consistent picture. Harvest yields were down 30–50% from normal levels across most of northern France. Food prices in urban markets had risen by 200–300% over the previous 5 years. Rural populations were migrating to cities in unprecedented numbers, creating social pressures that threatened public order. But what made the crisis of the 1670s particularly challenging was its persistence. Single-year harvest failures were not uncommon in pre-industrial Europe, and French administrative systems had developed sophisticated mechanisms for dealing with temporary food shortages. Royal granaries maintained emergency supplies that could be distributed during lean years. International trade networks could import grain from regions where harvests had been better. Religious and charitable institutions provided relief for the most vulnerable populations. However, the Maunder Minimum was creating not just single-year failures, but persistent multi-year patterns of poor harvests that overwhelmed these traditional coping mechanisms. The royal granaries had been depleted by repeated years of distributions. International grain markets were disrupted because the climate problems were affecting most of Europe simultaneously. Charitable institutions found themselves dealing with levels of need that far exceeded their resources. Standing in his failing wheatfields, Colbert was confronting not just an administrative challenge, but a fundamental question about the nature of royal government and its relationship to natural forces beyond human control. The elaborate system of absolute monarchy that Louis XIV was constructing depended on the assumption that royal power could impose order on society and ensure the welfare of the kingdom's subjects. But what was the meaning of royal authority when the sun itself seemed to be failing in its obligations? The scientific understanding of the time provided no useful explanations for what was happening. The heliocentric model of the solar system had been established for less than a century, and the idea that the sun's energy output might vary was completely unknown. Weather was understood as a product of divine will, atmospheric humors, or the influence of celestial bodies, but none of these traditional explanations provided guidance for dealing with persistent climate change. Some observers blamed the weather, problems on human sin, arguing that God was punishing France for its military aggression and religious persecution. Others pointed to astrological influences, claiming that unusual planetary alignments were disrupting the normal patterns of terrestrial weather. A few natural philosophers suggested that the weather problems might be related to volcanic eruptions or other geological phenomena, but these explanations were considered speculative and unsupported by evidence. The practical consequences of these failed explanations were significant. If the climate problems were caused by divine displeasure, the appropriate response was prayer, repentance, and religious reform. If they were caused by astrological influences, the solution might be found in careful timing of agricultural activities, according to planetary positions. If they were caused by natural phenomena, human beings might be powerless to change them and could only adapt to the new conditions. Colbert, as a practical administrator rather than a theologian or natural philosopher, was more interested in solutions than explanations. Throughout the 1670s, he had been experimenting with policies designed to mitigate the effects of persistent harvest failures. He had modified tax collection procedures to account for reduced agricultural productivity. He had reorganized grain importation to bring food from regions less affected by the climate problems. He had established new forms of poor relief designed to support rural populations during extended periods of scarcity. But by the summer of 1675, even these adaptive measures were proving inadequate to the scale of the crisis. As Colbert walked through his green and unripened wheat fields, calculating the losses that would affect not just his own estate, but the entire region, he was beginning to understand that the climate problems they were experiencing might not be temporary aberrations but permanent changes that would require fundamental transformations in how French society organized itself for survival. The question that would haunt him through the remaining decades of the Maunder Minimum was whether human institutions could adapt quickly enough to keep pace with environmental changes that seemed to be accelerating rather than moderating. The sun that had sustained European civilization for centuries appeared to be withdrawing its support, and nobody knew whether it would ever return to its former reliability. In the villages surrounding Colbert's estate, peasant families were making their own calculations about survival and adaptation. They had no understanding of solar cycles or their relationship to agricultural productivity, but they could see clearly that the old patterns of farming and the old expectations about harvest timing were no longer adequate guides for their survival. Like alpine villagers learning to make bread from nutshells, like London watermen learning to sell coffee on frozen rivers, the rural population of France was discovering that survival in the age of the monde minimum required constant innovation, adaptation, and the abandonment of traditional certainties about how the world worked. By the winter of 1678, the Royal Observatory at Paris had recorded something unprecedented in the history of systematic astronomical observation. For the third consecutive year, the sun's surface had remained virtually spotless throughout the entire solar cycle. Father Jean Picard, the observatory's director, meticulously documented each day's observations in his leather-bound logbooks, noting with growing concern that the solar disk remained smooth and unblemished week after week, month after month. What Father Picard was recording, though he could not have understood its significance, was the deepest phase of the monde minimum. The monde minimum and the Little Ice Age tells us that the monde minimum, MM, was a period of extremely low solar activity from approximately AD 1650 to 1715. During the worst years of this period, the sun produced fewer than one sunspot per year compared to the typical solar maximum of 100-200 spots. But the absence of sunspots was more than just an astronomical curiosity. Modern science has established clear connections between solar activity and terrestrial climate, though the mechanisms are complex and still not fully understood. During periods of low solar activity like the monde minimum, the sun's total energy output decreases slightly, but more importantly, the solar wind that helps shape Earth's magnetic field and atmospheric chemistry becomes weaker and less consistent. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, now entering his 8th year as Controller General, had commissioned Father Picard's observations as part of a broader effort to understand the persistent agricultural crisis that was affecting France. Colbert possessed one of the most analytical minds of his generation, and he was convinced that the weather problems plaguing the kingdom must have natural rather than supernatural causes. If those causes could be identified and understood, it might be possible to develop more effective responses to the crisis. The connection between solar observations and terrestrial weather was not obvious to 17th century natural philosophy, but Colbert had noticed that the worst harvest failures seemed to correlate with the periods when Father Picard recorded the fewest sunspots. This correlation was tentative and speculative, but it suggested possibilities for prediction and preparation that could prove valuable for royal administration. The practical implications of understanding weather patterns were enormous. If the government could predict which years would bring poor harvests, resources could be allocated more effectively. Grain imports could be arranged in advance rather than as emergency responses to crisis. Tax collection could be adjusted to account for predictable variations in agricultural productivity. Military campaigns could be planned to avoid periods when food supplies would be inadequate to support large armies. But prediction required understanding, and understanding the relationship between solar activity and terrestrial climate was beyond the scientific capabilities of the 17th century. Father Picard could document the absence of sunspots, and Colbert could document the persistence of harvest failures, but neither could explain why these phenomena might be connected or what their implications might be for the future. The absence of scientific explanation did not prevent practical experimentation. Throughout the late 1670s, Colbert had been implementing agricultural policies based on the assumption that the climate problems were likely to persist rather than resolve quickly. These policies represented a fundamental shift away from crisis management toward adaptation and resilience. The most significant innovation was the development of what Colbert called agricultural diversification strategies. Instead of concentrating French grain production on the most productive regions of the kingdom, royal policy began to encourage cultivation in marginal areas that might be less affected by the climate disruption. This meant supporting agricultural development in southern France, where Mediterranean climate patterns seemed more stable, and encouraging the cultivation of crops that were more tolerant of cold and wet conditions. The potato, recently introduced from the Americas, became a particular focus of these diversification efforts. Potatoes could survive conditions that destroyed grain crops, and they provided more calories per acre than traditional European staples. But peasant resistance to potato cultivation was enormous. The potato was considered animal food, suitable for pigs but not for humans. Religious authorities worried that eating a plant not mentioned in the Bible might be sinful. Medical opinion held that potatoes caused diseases ranging from leprosy to sexual dysfunction. Overcoming this resistance required more than royal proclamation. Colbert developed a sophisticated campaign of education and incentive designed to gradually change peasant attitudes toward potato cultivation. Royal agricultural experts were sent to demonstrate potato growing techniques. Tax incentives were offered to farmers who devoted portions of their land to potato production. Public feasts were organized where court officials conspicuously consumed potato dishes to demonstrate their safety and respectability. But perhaps most importantly, Colbert ensured that emergency food distributions during times of scarcity included potatoes alongside traditional grains. When people were hungry enough, their resistance to unfamiliar foods disappeared quickly. The crisis created by the Monde minimum became an opportunity to transform French agriculture in ways that would ultimately make it more resilient and productive. The transformation was not limited to crop selection. French agriculture during the 1670s and 1680s underwent fundamental changes in farming techniques, land use patterns, and social organization. The persistent climate problems had made traditional agricultural practices unreliable, forcing innovation and experimentation at every level of rural society. Peasant farmers began to adopt more sophisticated crop rotation systems that could maintain soil fertility even when weather conditions prevented optimal growing conditions. They learned to extend growing seasons by using cold frames and other protective techniques that could shelter vulnerable plants from unexpected frosts. They developed new methods of food preservation that could extend the storage life of harvested crops and provide security against future shortages. The social organization of rural communities also evolved in response to the crisis. Villages developed more elaborate systems of mutual aid and resource sharing that could help individual families survive temporary food shortages. Markets expanded to connect regions with different agricultural specialties, creating trade networks that could redistribute food from areas of relative abundance to areas of scarcity. Credit systems evolved to allow farmers to invest in long-term improvements, even when current harvests were inadequate to support immediate needs. These adaptations were occurring not just in France, but throughout Europe as communities struggled to cope with the persistent climate disruption of the Monde minimum. Carbon Brief explains that while this has been termed the Little Ice Age and is often wrongly linked with the Monde minimum in solar activity, the correlation between reduced solar activity and agricultural crisis was real and significant, even if the causal mechanisms were not understood at the time. The Dutch Republic, despite being affected by the same climate problems as its neighbors, managed to maintain agricultural productivity through innovations in drainage, crop selection, and international trade. The English, dealing with similar harvest failures, accelerated their agricultural revolution by adopting new crops, improving livestock breeding, and developing more efficient farming techniques. The German states, perhaps most severely affected by the climate disruption, developed new forms of rural social organization that could provide mutual support during extended periods of scarcity. But it was in France, with its large population, centralized government, and detailed administrative records, that the relationship between solar activity and social change was most clearly documented. Colbert's archives, preserved in the French National Library, provide an unprecedented record of how a pre-industrial society attempted to understand and adapt to persistent climate change. By 1680, as Father Picard continued his daily observations of the spotless sun, and as Colbert continued his efforts to transform French agriculture, it had become clear that the weather problems of the 1670s were not temporary aberrations, but part of a longer pattern that might persist for decades. The question facing French society was no longer how to survive a temporary crisis, but how to rebuild their civilization around new assumptions about climate, agriculture, and the relationship between human society and natural forces. The mathematics of solar silence were becoming clear. When the sun reduced its activity, European agriculture failed. When agriculture failed, societies had to transform or collapse. The challenge was whether the transformation could occur quickly enough and thoroughly enough to prevent the collapse. On March 15, 1715, Father Antoine de Jussieu stood in the courtyard of the Royal Observatory at Paris, adjusting the focus on his improved solar telescope as the morning sun climbed above the rooftops of the city. For the first time in nearly 70 years, the sun's surface showed the familiar pattern of dark spots that had been absent throughout most of the monde minimum. After decades of solar silence, the sun was awakening from its long dormancy, and with it came the promise that the agricultural crisis that had defined European life for 3 generations might finally be ending. Father de Jussieu was the successor to Jean Picard, who had died in 1682, still recording the spotless sun that had become the astronomical signature of the late 17th century. The transition between the two astronomers represented more than just a change in personnel. It marked the passage from an era of crisis to an era of cautious recovery, from a time when the sun seemed to be failing in its fundamental obligations, to a time when normal solar activity was gradually returning. The sunspots that Father de Jussieu observed through his telescope in 1715 were harbingers of what would become known as solar cycle 0, the first normal solar cycle in more than half
a century.
NASA science notes that the end of the monde minimum marked the beginning of the gradual warming that would eventually lead to more stable agricultural conditions throughout Europe. But the recovery was neither immediate nor complete. Jean-Baptiste Colbert had died in 1683 after spending the final years of his life implementing the agricultural reforms that would ultimately allow France to survive and eventually prosper despite the climate challenges of the monde minimum. His successors, particularly Claude Le Pelletier and later Nicolas Desmarets, continued and expanded the policies of agricultural diversification, international trade, and social adaptation that Colbert had pioneered. By 1715, French agriculture bore little resemblance to the farming systems that had existed at the beginning of the monde minimum in 1645. The potato, once rejected as animal food, had become a staple crop throughout northern France. New World crops like maize and beans had been integrated into traditional crop rotation systems. Improved varieties of traditional grains, selected for their tolerance to cold and wet conditions, had replaced the cultivars that had failed so dramatically during the worst years of the climate crisis. But perhaps more importantly, French society had developed new institutions and practices that made it more resilient to climate variability. The administrative systems that Colbert had created for managing food distribution and agricultural policy had evolved into sophisticated networks for predicting, preparing for, and responding to harvest variations. International trade relationships had been established that could quickly redirect food supplies from regions of abundance to regions of scarcity. Social safety nets had been developed that could support vulnerable populations during times of agricultural stress. The rural population had also been transformed by their experience of surviving the monde minimum. Peasant families in 1715 possessed knowledge and skills that their ancestors in 1645 could never have imagined. They could cultivate and prepare dozens of crops that had been unknown or ignored by previous generations. They understood weather, patterns and their relationship to agricultural success, with a sophistication that had been developed through decades of careful observation and painful experience. They participated in trade networks and credit systems that connected their local communities to regional, national, and international markets. The psychological impact of surviving the Maunder minimum was equally significant. Rural communities had learned that their survival depended not on maintaining traditional practices, but on their ability to adapt continuously to changing circumstances. They had developed what might be called a climate change mentality, an understanding that environmental conditions were not stable, that traditional knowledge was not always adequate, and that survival required constant vigilance, experimentation, and adaptation. This transformation was not unique to France. Throughout Europe, societies that had survived the Maunder minimum emerged from the experience with new capabilities and new confidence in their ability to manage environmental challenges. The Dutch had perfected their techniques of land reclamation and water management, creating agricultural systems that were virtually immune to weather variations. The English had accelerated their agricultural revolution, developing farming techniques that would eventually make them the most productive agricultural society in Europe. The German states had developed new forms of cooperative rural organization that would influence agricultural development for centuries. But the end of the Maunder minimum did not mark a return to the climate conditions of the early 17th century. The Little Ice Age would continue for another century, bringing new challenges and requiring continued adaptation. However, the societies that emerged from the Maunder minimum were fundamentally better equipped to meet those challenges than their predecessors had been. The summer of 1715 brought the best harvests that Northern Europe had experienced in decades. Father de Jussieu recorded not only the return of normal sunspot activity, but also the return of normal weather patterns, adequate rainfall during the growing season, sufficient warmth for grain ripening, and harvest conditions that allowed crops to be gathered and stored successfully. But the successful harvest of 1715 was celebrated not as a return to normalcy, but as a vindication of the adaptations and innovations that had been developed during the crisis years. The crops that produced abundant yields in 1715 were not the same varieties that had failed so dramatically in the 1670s and 1680s. The farming techniques that proved successful were not the traditional methods that had been adequate before the Maunder minimum. The social and economic systems that distributed and consumed the harvest were not the same institutions that had struggled to cope with the agricultural crisis of the late 17th century. In village churches throughout France, priests offered prayers of thanksgiving for the abundant harvest, but they also reminded their congregations of the lessons learned during the decades of scarcity. The knowledge of how to survive on marginal foods, how to adapt to changing weather patterns, how to cooperate during times of crisis. All of this hard-won wisdom was preserved and passed down to the next generation as insurance against future challenges. The children who had grown up during the worst years of the Maunder minimum were adults by 1715, and they brought to positions of leadership and responsibility a perspective shaped by their experience of prolonged crisis and successful adaptation. These individuals would guide European society through the remaining challenges of the Little Ice Age and lay the foundations for the agricultural and industrial developments that would transform European civilization in the 18th and 19th centuries. The return of normal solar activity in 1715 marked the end of one of the most challenging periods in European history, but it also marked the beginning of a new era of human relationship with environmental change. The societies that had survived the Maunder minimum had learned that human communities could not depend on environmental stability, but they had also learned that human intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability could overcome even the most severe environmental challenges. Father de Jussieu continued his solar observations for another 20 years, documenting the gradual return to normal patterns of solar activity and their correlation with improved agricultural conditions throughout Europe. His records, like those of his predecessor Jean Picard, provided some of the earliest systematic evidence of the relationship between solar variability and terrestrial climate, knowledge that would eventually contribute to modern understanding of climate change and human adaptation. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Maunder Minimum was not scientific knowledge, but practical wisdom about human resilience and adaptability. The people who lived through 70 years of climate disruption had proven that human societies could survive and even thrive in the face of environmental challenges that seemed insurmountable. They had demonstrated that crisis could become opportunity, that necessity could drive innovation, and that cooperation could overcome scarcity. As the sun gradually returned to its normal patterns of activity, and as European agriculture gradually returned to reliable productivity, the survivors of the Maunder Minimum carried with them the knowledge that no crisis was permanent, no challenge was insurmountable, and no environmental change was beyond human capacity to address. That knowledge would prove invaluable in the centuries of continued change that lay ahead as human societies continued to adapt, innovate, and endure in an ever-changing world. The long winter was over, but the lessons it had taught would last forever. In learning to survive when the sun seemed to fail, Europeans had discovered something fundamental about human nature, that creativity, cooperation, and determination could sustain life and community even in the darkest times. That discovery would guide them through all the challenges yet to come. The chill that killed peasants during the Little Ice Age lasted for more than 5 centuries, from roughly 1300 to 1850, but its legacy lives on in the knowledge, institutions, and cultural practices that emerged from humanity's long struggle with climate change. Through 4 detailed stories, the Great Famine of 1315, the Thames Frost Fairs of the 1680s, the Alpine villagers who survived on nutshells during the 1690s, and the agricultural transformation during the Maunder Minimum, we have seen how ordinary people responded to extraordinary challenges with creativity, determination, and a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Each crisis taught different lessons. The Great Famine showed how quickly established social systems could collapse when their fundamental assumptions proved false, but also how new economic relationships could emerge from the ruins of the old. The Thames Frost Fairs demonstrated that disaster could become opportunity, that communities could create entirely new forms of social and economic life when circumstances demanded it. The Alpine villages revealed the extent of human resourcefulness in the face of scarcity and the importance of traditional knowledge combined with innovative adaptation. The Maunder Minimum illustrated how societies could transform themselves systematically to meet persistent environmental challenges. Together, these stories reveal something profound about the relationship between human communities and environmental change. The Little Ice Age was not just a period of cold weather, it was a time when human societies throughout Europe were forced to reinvent themselves, to develop new technologies and institutions, to create new forms of cooperation and knowledge, and to discover new possibilities for survival and prosperity in a changing world. The peasants who died during the Little Ice Age were not simply victims of climate change. They were participants in one of the most significant periods of human adaptation in recorded history. Their suffering was real and should not be minimized, but their creativity, resilience, and determination in the face of unprecedented challenges helped to create the modern world. The innovations they developed, the institutions they created, and the knowledge they preserved became the foundation for later developments in agriculture, commerce, science, and social organization. As you drift off to sleep, consider this. The world you live in today was shaped by countless individuals who faced seemingly impossible challenges and found ways to survive, adapt, and thrive. The Little Ice Age reminds us that human beings have always lived in a changing world, and that our capacity for creativity and cooperation has always been our greatest resource for meeting whatever challenges the future might bring. The chill has passed, but the lessons remain, boring perhaps in their attention to practical details of daily survival, but also profound in their demonstration of human resilience and the endless possibilities for adaptation that emerge when communities work together to meet the challenges of a changing world.